everyone, Xin Chào Vietnam. This is a video for Earth Day, a celebration of Earth Day. My name is Claudia Lifton. I am the Denver director of the Factory Farming Awareness Coalition. We are a nonprofit organization that talks to people about the impacts of our food choices. So today we'll be talking a little bit about the basics of factory farming, standard practices within the industry, but our main focus today will be on the environmental impacts of the industry. We all used to sing Old MacDonald, and when we walk into grocery stores, we often see marketing images that remind us of Old MacDonald's farm. We see rolling green hills, happy cows, but that's not what this industry looks like anymore. The animals that we eat today are raised on concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, which is the technical term for a factory farm. So typically when I ask people this question, how many animals are killed each year for food in the United States, the answer is something like 500 million, 100 million, even 50,000. But a lot of people are shocked to find out that the answer is 9 billion. So that means every single year in the United States, we kill 9 billion animals for food. Worldwide, it's about 75 billion, and it's roughly 1 million animals per hour in the United States. And a lot of people are actually also shocked to find out that 99% of these animals are raised on factory farms, or these concentrated animal feeding operations that we saw earlier. So to understand the factory farm, it's important to really understand its underlying mentality, which was arguably put best by the National Hog Farmer magazine, who said that the breeding sow should be thought of and treated as a valuable piece of machinery, whose function is to pump out baby pigs like a sausage machine. This mentality allows animals on factory farms to be treated in ways that we wouldn't dream of treating our dogs and cats at home. These animals are no longer seen as individual sentient creatures. They're really viewed as units of profit. And the hallmark of factory farming is intensive confinement, essentially the practice of keeping animals immobilized in crates and cages for their entire lives. So here we can see a mother pig or a breeding sow locked in what's called a gestation crate. She'll spend about 2.5 years in one of these crates, literally never able to even turn around or fully extend her limbs. She'll be impregnated or artificially inseminated every few months. Her babies will be slaughtered at 6 months, and she'll be sent to slaughter at roughly 2.5 when she's too weak or sick to be profitable for insemination again. Here we can see a field of calves who have just been taken from their mothers. So we probably all know that cows have to have babies to produce milk. And for humans to get profitable amounts of milk from cows, their babies are taken just a few hours after they're born. It's a really traumatic experience for the mothers and the babies. They often bellow for weeks after being separated. The females are put in these small hutches like we see here, where they'll never see their mothers again. And as soon as they're large enough to be impregnated, they'll live through the same fate as their mothers. And the males will be killed at about 6 months old to be sold for veal. This is how 99% of egg-laying hens spend their lives in the US. They have about the size of a single sheet of printer paper to stand on for their whole lives. And we can see some baby turkeys on a turkey factory farm. So again, this is how 99% of the animals raised and killed for food in the United States live and die. This, of course, has some pretty serious animal welfare implications, but it also has quite a bit to do with why the industry is so deeply environmentally destructive. I do just want to quickly address some of the different labels we see in grocery stores. I'm sure we've all seen labels like free range and organic. And I want to talk about what these labels truly mean. So this is a cage-free facility. Obviously, the animals are not in individual cages, but they still have just about the size of a sheet of printer paper to stand on. The actual definition of free range is that some animals have some access to some outdoors some of the time. So there could be a massive shed with 30, 40,000 birds and a really small door cut into one end of that shed that opens up to a small dirt patch. Even if one single bird can never fit through the door, it's still technically considered free range. So that's the label on Judy's eggs. It says, these hens are raised in wide open spaces in Sonoma Valley where they are free to roam, scratch, and play. And then we can see a picture of Judy's eggs facility. Probably don't see any chickens roaming, scratching, or playing. So this company also rebrands themselves as Uncle Eddie's, Rock Island, Gold Circle, Whole Foods 365 brand, and Organic Valley. The organic label has very little to do with animal welfare. It's really just about input. So the animals are not fed genetically modified crops or feed that's been grown with the use of pesticides. They can't be given preventative antibiotics or hormones, but they're still living in the same conditions and generally sent to the same slaughterhouses. So we are done talking about the animals now. We are going to spend the rest of our time today talking about the environment and the impacts of animal agriculture on our planet. We do have a little cuteness interlude between every section, just to give everyone a moment to take a deep breath. I know this stuff can be distressing, but we are going to move on now and talk about the seafood industry. So we've all heard the term overfishing. Due to overfishing, many scientists believe that there could be more plastic than fish in the oceans by 2048. That's because of what we see here. This is called a super trawler. It uses a net roughly a mile long that's dragged along the ocean floor, picking up everything in its wake. So imagine thousands of these boats with thousands of these nets just emptying the oceans every hour of every day. It's clearly not sustainable. And of course, there are so many other animals in the oceans: dolphins, turtles, whales, sharks. These animals are often caught in these nets, suffocated and killed in the process, and just thrown overboard dead, which is a problem the industry refers to as bycatch. And we often talk about plastic pollution in our oceans, and the focus is pretty regularly on straws or plastic bags. And it's absolutely incredibly important to reduce our use of single-use plastics. But just to give you an idea of scale, straws make up 0.003% of plastic pollution in the oceans, while the seafood industry is responsible for 46%. So almost half of every single piece of plastic in the oceans is fishing nets and ghost gear from these big fishing boats. So obviously the most powerful thing that we can do to protect aquatic life is to simply not support the #1 cause of death of aquatic life. And as wild fish populations dwindle, a lot of companies are turning to aquaculture or fish farming, which now makes up roughly half of the world's fish supply. And they're just giant netted factory farms in bodies of water that house millions of fish barely able to move. And they're pooping a lot. They're producing a tremendous amount of manure. That manure drifts into the neighboring ecosystems, causing something called dead zones. So surrounding these facilities, everything is killed. Everything is killed off. All of the oxygen has been suffocated out of the water and nothing can survive. And then, of course, whenever you have animals so closely confined, they're going to get stressed and attack each other. So to prevent them from dying from infection, their feed is also laced with antibiotics, which then, of course, also leaches into neighboring ecosystems, affecting wildlife. In regards to shrimp specifically, 90% of the shrimp sold in the United States is imported from Southeast Asia, where mangrove forests are being completely decimated to clear space for shrimp farms. Mangroves are incredible trees that grow in coastal waters, And they actually absorb 4 times more CO2 than rainforests. And they're being decimated to clear space for shrimp farms. And a darker side to the seafood industry that not many of us are aware of is the use of slavery. So people are often trafficked into the seafood industry in Southeast Asia. They're chained to the decks of boats for years and killed if they try to escape. And the shrimping industry uses child slaves. Children are forced to work for up to 16 hours a day, deshelling shrimp that's then imported to the US. So one really small but powerful and practical change that we can make as individuals is to try to avoid shrimp. It's an incredibly destructive industry. Moving on to the environmental impacts of land animal agriculture. It is one of the most destructive industries on Earth. And here's why. Remember, we're killing 9 billion animals a year to feed 350 million Americans. That's more animals just in this country than there are people on the planet. And these are living, breathing, eating, drinking, pooping animals. We're going to talk a lot about poop today. And that's really where the problem comes in. These animals are mostly eating genetically modified corn and soy. They're the largest consumers of corn and soy in the world, and a vast majority of the world's genetically modified crops are only grown to feed factory-farmed animals. Which is why meat production is an incredibly inefficient way of feeding people. It requires up to 15 times more feed than the amount of meat produced. So if we were to cut global meat consumption in half, we could adequately feed the entire world's human population, plus an extra 2 billion people using that land. So think about it like this. Imagine in my kitchen here, I have some soil and I'm going to grow some crops. I could use my limited soil, my limited amount of land, to grow 15 pounds of genetically modified monocultured soy. That would feed 1 cow, produce 1 pound of beef, and feed maybe 2 people. Or I could use my land more efficiently to grow 15 pounds of rice and beans and nuts and legumes and fruits and vegetables that could then feed maybe 15 people. We've been hearing a lot about the fires in the Amazon recently. A lot of people don't realize that they're actually directly linked to cattle ranching. Most of these fires are being started by ranchers who want to clear more space for grazing cattle. In fact, according to the United Nations, 65% of all Amazon deforestation is directly linked to meat and dairy production. Which is why our taste for meat is really wreaking havoc on ecosystems and wildlife. Between 1970 and 2010, 52% of the Earth's wildlife disappeared. That's because we started tearing down biodiverse forests and replacing them with factory farms, with corn and soy monoculture to feed to factory farmed animals, and with grazing cattle. So now, as we can see, only 4% of the Earth's mammals are wildlife. Roughly 1/3 are humans, and 2/3 are livestock. This is the true overpopulation problem that we have on this planet. It's not really a human overpopulation issue, it's a livestock one. And often, grass-fed beef is advertised as a more eco-friendly or sustainable alternative to factory-farmed meat. But that's not really the case. And here's why. So it is true that certain ecosystems can benefit from having a small number of ruminant grazing animals. But there's something called a carrying capacity, which is a limit to the amount of animals that can be sustainably grazed on a piece of land without depleting its resources. And currently, over half of US taxpayer subsidized land is overgrazed, which essentially means that the ratio of cow to grass is just too high. So once all of the grass has disappeared, the cows start eating everything else. All of the trees, shoots, shrubs, bushes, plants that would have turned into habitat for wildlife and would have grown roots, which could have prevented soil erosion. And this is pretty devastating for ecosystems. Here we can see a real-world example from India. We can see what part of their rainforest or part of their forest looked like in 2002 when they were grazing cattle in that land. Essentially, it was turning into desert. The soil was blowing away. So they consulted with scientists who recommended removing the cattle from that land. We can see what the same piece of land looks like just 4 years later, after the cattle had been removed. To make matters worse, in the United States, there's a government agency called Wildlife Services that killed 3.2 million native animals in 2015 alone at the request of ranchers. So they kill predators that might threaten livestock and small mammals that could dig holes into the earth that the cows could fall into. We are quite literally destroying entire ecosystems to make them more suitable for grazing grass-fed beef. And all of this corn and soy is genetically modified to withstand Monsanto's Roundup pesticides. Now, I want to be clear, I am not saying that GMO technology is as a whole good or bad. I'm saying that in the United States, it's not really being used for the benefit of people. It's being used to grow tremendous amounts of corn and soy monoculture to feed to factory farmed animals. The issue here is that these crops are specifically modified to withstand Monsanto's Roundup pesticides. So with a rise in the use of these particular types of genetically modified crops comes a rise in the use of pesticides and herbicides. And that is empirically dangerous, not only for consumers, but also for workers, wildlife, pollinators like bees and butterflies, health of soil, and freshwater, groundwater sources. 1/3 of global pesticide use is actually just for meat production. And finally, something very relevant to what's going on in our world today is that few people realize that 80% of the antibiotics produced in this country are fed to the animals that we then eat. Humans are prescribed roughly 3 million pounds of antibiotics a year. Animals are fed 10 times that amount. And the relationship between antibiotics and bacteria is kind of like an arms race. We have thousands of stressed, sick animals packed into filthy sheds. And they're being fed subtherapeutic levels of antibiotics to keep them just barely alive until they're big enough to be profitable for slaughter in conditions that would probably kill them within a few days or weeks. But of course, poop is the perfect breeding ground for bacteria. And these animals are living amongst their own waste, the waste of thousands of animals who had previously been housed in this facility. So it's quite easy for bacteria to grow. That bacteria can really easily evolve and become resistant to the antibiotics that they're fed. This antibiotic-resistant bacteria can spread to the other animals in the facilities, to the workers in the facilities, and really is the perfect breeding ground for a pandemic. Recent studies found that the majority of meat purchased in grocery stores contains antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So as people get food poisoning and stomach bugs, more and more of us have to be hospitalized because our strains are antibiotic-resistant. And this is already deadly. MRSA is an antibiotic-resistant staph infection that's thought to have developed on factory farms. If you live near a factory farm, you're 3 times more likely to be a MRSA carrier. And 48% of all hog farm workers tested positive as MRSA carriers. And MRSA kills more Americans per year than AIDS. So this is one of the most serious threats facing humanity as we know it. We could potentially face a post-antibiotic era where we could die from strep throat or going to the dentist for an infection because we're immune to these life-saving drugs. And of course, all of this corn and soy uses a tremendous amount of water to grow. When people talk to us about how to reduce our water footprint, we're often told to take shorter showers, turn off the faucet while we brush our teeth, don't water the lawn. And while these are a really great place to start, the impact is pretty negligible compared to our food choices. Because actually, you can save the same amount of water by skipping 1 gallon of milk or by not taking 27 showers. And 1 hamburger takes 660 gallons of water to produce, which equates to roughly 38 showers. There's a lot of misinformation out there about almond milk in the media. It's often said that almond milk is bad for the environment because it's very water intensive. And while it is true, as we can see, that almond milk has a higher water footprint than, say, oat or soy milk, it's still about half of the water footprint of cow's milk, and on average has one of the lowest land and carbon footprints. So no matter what type of plant milk, it will always have a lower water, land, and carbon footprint comparatively. And then finally, of course, these billions of animals are pooping a lot. They produce a tremendous amount of waste, more than the entire US human population. And a lot of people think that this waste is used for fertilizer, but this is not the case anymore with these giant corporations, because the waste is mixed in with lots of toxins, antibiotics, hormones, steroids, so they can't use it for fertilizer. So we're actually going to watch a video to see what happens with all of this waste.
One of America's biggest secrets is that farms practically don't exist anymore. The animals we eat are grown inside giant hidden factories. Since 2012, I've been secretly planning a project to expose these factory farms using the highest tech spy equipment available: drones. This video provides just a sample of what I saw during only a few days of filming. You're looking at a lake of toxic pig feces and urine the size of 4 football fields. That's because thousands upon thousands of pigs are inside of these buildings. Their waste falls through slats in the concrete floor, and it's flushed directly into this giant open-air cesspool. How many of these kinds of factories are there? In North Carolina alone, there are over 2,000, and the consequences are disastrous.
The waste falls through the floors. It's flushed out into an open pit, like a cesspool. It's easy for a big hog operation to have as much waste as a medium-sized city. Of course, the pit will fill up, so it has to be emptied, and they're emptied by spraying the liquid waste.
Yes, you heard that right.
If you're familiar with a garden sprayer, they're gigantic versions of that, so they're making droplets, fine mists out of this liquid waste, and that can drift downwind into the neighboring communities.
I shut my hog operation down when I got out of it, and I just couldn't do another person that way to make them smell bad. It is a cesspool that you put feces and urine in, a hole in the ground that you dump a toxic waste in, and I've seen dead hogs in them and stuff like that.
People can't open their windows, they can't go outside.
I've seen it. I've talked to the people. I've seen the little children that say, Mom and Daddy, why we got to smell this stuff? You get stories like, I can't hang my clothes out. Feces and urine odor comes by and attaches itself to your clothes. And then people will say, we're scared to invite neighbors.
It can, I think, very correctly be called environmental racism or environmental injustice, that people of color, low-income people, bear the brunt of these practices.
This is where they spray animal waste on us. This is about 8 feet from my mother's house.
What is it like when the mist is?
It's like, you think it's raining?
Really?
You think it's raining. We don't open the doors of the windows, but the odor still comes in. It takes your breath away. Then you start gagging, you get headaches.
There are a number of studies of asthma and asthma symptoms, particularly in children near these facilities. Among adults, there are reports of several types of upper respiratory symptoms. These pollutants are affecting people's blood pressure.
Who's responsible for all this? Smithfield Foods, specifically the subdivision Murphy Brown, which controls the factory farms shown in all of the drone footage in this video. Smithfield is by far the largest pork producer in the entire world. And inside these buildings, there is something else entirely.
Pigs are really intelligent animals. They are more intelligent than dogs. They are more intelligent than cats. In the average pig barn, there could be hundreds, if not thousands of pigs crammed into this one sprawling indoor space. Their entire life is spent standing on concrete floors. Mother pigs are locked in metal cages so small that they literally cannot even turn around for months at a time.
This is not a partisan issue. We are all opposed to children being made sick, to animals being abused, and to everyday people's lives being ruined by the stench of cesspools in their backyards. These thousands of lakes of toxic waste must be among the most bizarre and disturbing environmental phenomena that have ever confronted America. And they've been kept well hidden from the public for long enough.
So a lot of people ask, how could this possibly be legal? The reality is that this industry has so much political power that even though animal agriculture is considered a leading cause of water and air pollution in the US, they're actually exempt from the Clean Air Act. So the EPA does not collect data on or punish factory farms for emitting airborne toxins. Factory farms have been documented emitting hydrogen sulfide and ammonia at levels 10 times higher than would be legally allowed for any other industry, such as, say, the oil and gas industry. So small communities really suffer the consequences. Of course, all of this waste is also a leading cause of water pollution, having polluted 35,000 miles of river in 22 states. This makes the water totally unsafe for drinking, but it also destroys ecosystems and kills wildlife. Now, one of the problems with all of this waste is that it contains excess amounts of phosphorus and nitrogen, which algae thrives on. So it blooms like crazy, causing almost a toxic blanket to form. This prevents sunlight from getting in, depletes the water of oxygen, and kills everything. So this is a process called eutrophication. It can cause complete ecosystem collapse, and it takes up to 1,000 years to be reversed. Runoff from factory farms and the fertilizer used to grow the crops that are fed to factory farmed animals has led to a dead zone larger than the state of New Jersey off of the Gulf of Mexico. And it is just entirely devoid of any life. Finally, all of this poop contributes to climate change. When people typically talk to us about how to reduce our carbon footprint, the general rhetoric is to drive less or carpool, ride our bikes, even get a hybrid car. But just like I said earlier, that taking shorter showers has a pretty small impact on our water footprint compared to our food choices, the same actually goes for driving less. Driving less has a pretty negligible impact on our carbon footprint compared to our food choices, because the meat and dairy industries produce far more greenhouse gases than all of the world's planes, trains, cars, buses, and boats combined, more than the entire transportation sector globally. In fact, recent studies found that the top 5 meat and dairy producers produce more greenhouse gases than BP, Shell, and ExxonMobil. Now, I know that we've talked about some shocking and slightly disturbing information today, but there is some good news. It's that finally world leaders, politicians, and global organizations are waking up and pushing back against this incredibly powerful industry. And they agree that the basic solution here is simple. We have to eat less meat. That is, if we'd like to have the resources to feed the growing human population, and if we want to avoid global catastrophic food and water shortages, climate-induced natural disasters, and pandemics at a scale we have never seen before. We have got to switch from animal-based to plant-based proteins. But of course, changing our lives, especially changing our diets overnight, is not an option for most of us. And that's okay, which is why starting small with something like Meatless Mondays is actually a really great response to this issue. And it might not sound like much, how could not eating meat or cheese one day a week make any kind of significant impact in such a massive global issue? But if everyone in the US ate no meat or cheese just one day a week, it would have the same impact as driving 91 billion miles less or taking 7.6 million cars off of US roads. What sounds more reasonable? Getting almost 8 million Americans to give up their cars and never ever drive again, or asking people to eat vegetables and fruits one day a week, while reducing their own risks of dying from completely preventable diseases. This is the most powerful and practical thing that we can do for the planet. But what about protein? We have often been led to believe that we need to consume animal products for protein, and it just is not the case. So we're going to watch the trailer for a documentary on Netflix about plant-based athletes.
One and only Arnold Schwarzenegger.
I ate a lot of meat. They showed us commercials.
Steak. That's what a man eats.
Selling that idea that real men eat meat.
Serious man food.
But you got to understand, that's marketing. That's not based on reality.
I've been teaching fighting techniques to government agencies for more than 15 years. Then I got injured, unable to teach for at least 6 months. I spent more than 1,000 hours studying science on recovery and nutrition, and stumbled across a study about the Roman gladiators.
The gladiators were predominantly vegetarian.
How could the original professional fighters be so powerful, eating only plants?
When I made the switch to a plant-based diet, I qualified for my 3rd Olympic team. I broke 2 American records. I was like, man, I should have done this a long while ago.
When I went plant-based, I wasn't sure if I was going to survive. And I actually became like a machine.
One of the biggest misconceptions in sports nutrition is that we have to have animal protein to perform at a high level. That's just not true.
Sometimes you have to do things that you know your competitors aren't doing.
Today's blood and yesterday's blood.
Yeah. I think this is going to wake a lot of people up. I was recovering better, not getting as sore. This was our best season in the last 15 years, and we had 14 guys on plant-based diets.
We all want to feel great, have more energy. Cholesterol, 276. Today, 169.
Whoa, now you're talking. Most guys my age can keep up with the grandchildren. My grandchildren can't keep up with me.
It's not one set of dietary guidelines for improving your performance as an athlete, another one for reversing heart disease, reversing diabetes. It's the same for all of them.
Someone asked me, how could you get as strong as an ox without eating any meat? And my answer was, have you ever seen an ox eating meat?
I highly recommend this documentary. It's pretty amazing. There are also some incredibly high-tech solutions, promising high-tech solutions to this issue as well, such as cultured or clean meat. So we've all heard about 3D printing organs, I'm assuming. Basically, scientists have figured out how to use stem cells to grow actual human organs in labs. And you can't put a fake organ into someone's body. We are people. We need real people parts. So they're growing real human organs. It's just coming from a lab instead of a cadaver or a dead body. And that's the same thing they've done with meat. Taking stem cells from animals and growing actual animal flesh in a lab. It's not like meat, it is meat. It is the real connective tissue, muscle, and fat of an animal. But it's got a 99% lower land footprint and a 96% lower water and carbon footprint. The technology is already available. They have already figured out how to make it. People have already tried it. Right now, they're just working on making it more cost competitive. But the hope is that it will be readily available at cost competitive prices in American supermarkets within the next 5 to 7 years. And I really hope it puts me out of a job. But if we don't want to wait 5 to 7 years, we can start making better choices now by eating products that taste and feel pretty much just like the foods we love. Typically, I would have brought all of you some Gardein chicken strips to try. I would have given it to you at the beginning of class and told you at the very end that they were actually vegan. And I don't think I've ever had a student be able to tell that it wasn't real chicken until I told them at the end of class. So we really don't have to give up the tastes and textures we enjoy to make healthier, kinder, more sustainable choices. That chicken, as you can see, it's the Gardein crispy tenders. They also make meatballs, teriyaki chicken, beef crumbles, burgers, sliders, hot dogs, sausages, breakfast burritos. You can find it in really any Target, Walmart, King Soopers, or Safeway in the country. Anything you can eat, I can eat vegan. Because veganism is trending, because it's profitable and popular and marketable, even giant corporations like Wendy's, Carl's Jr., Taco Bell, Del Taco, and Burger King are introducing plant-based alternatives to their menus.
We conducted an experiment to evaluate how well Whopper fans know their beloved Whopper. The people you will see here are real people, and these are their real reactions.
I've probably eaten about 2 Whoppers a week for the last 20 years. I love Whoppers. I've turned Burger King into a crime scene a time or two.
I absolutely love beef. Beef all the way.
If it's not beef, I don't want it. First bite, I would know the difference between beef and whatever else you have.
Little do they know, their Whopper patty was actually made from plants.
You're f***ing kidding me.
We're not, Grant.
Wait, plant-based? What are you talking about?
No animals, just plants.
Really? This is a f***ing cow.
No f***ing cow.
Tastes like a Whopper. Tastes like a Whopper. Tastes like a beef burger. It's made of f***ing beef right here. You see that? That's beef.
We swear, it's not beef.
That's impossible. It tasted just like a Whopper should taste.
Lies!
A patty with 0 milligrams of cholesterol, 17 grams of protein, 100% Whopper, and 0% beef. We know it's impossible to believe.
Burger King doesn't care about us. They did not add a vegan option to their menu altruistically to help Americans reduce our rates of heart disease and diabetes. We essentially, the consumer, forced them to add a vegan option to their menu because we're demanding better choices. If we hadn't essentially forced them to add a vegan option to their menu, they never would have done it. And that speaks to the power of the individual consumer. Because people like you and me are learning about these issues and making kinder, healthier, more sustainable choices every day, the meatless meat industry is now one of the fastest growing markets in the nation, with investors like Bill Gates, Cargill, and Tyson Foods. Cargill, one of the largest meat producers on earth, sold all of the feedlots that they owned in the United States to free up funding to invest into plant-based proteins. And Tyson, one of the largest meat producers in the US, invested $150 million into plant-based proteins, started to develop their own brand of vegan chicken, and Tom Hayes, the CEO of Tyson at the time, said publicly, in summary, that due to consumer trends, the future of protein is plants. That is tremendously powerful. That speaks to the power of the individual consumer, of our dollar, of supply and demand more than anything else could. When there are so many awful things happening in this world, I know it can be easy to feel helpless and hopeless and powerless, maybe even a little apathetic. Honestly, I used to feel like there was nothing I could really do to help the world, so I wasn't going to try to do anything at all. I was going to bury my head in the sand because it was just too overwhelming. But then I realized that this is something we can really do. This is the one thing that we can do as individuals with this big of an impact on every major world issue. We learned that driving less has a pretty negligible impact on climate change, but replacing one burger a week with that vegan chicken or an Impossible Whopper from Burger King has a big impact. Not only on climate change, but on water scarcity, water pollution, deforestation, species extinction, human rights abuses, animal welfare, public health, and world hunger all at once. You can be a superhero every day. You can change the world. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't. Not a single day goes by that we don't have an impact on the world around us, and it's entirely up to us what kind of an impact we want that to be.